start cast drawing in the manner I start most every drawing, with a simple containing shape called an envelope. The envelope, as its name suggests, is a shape of a few straight lines that connect the limits of the cast. What makes these straight lines significant is that they're not a literal description of the contour, but instead they're lines drawn that are meant to describe the relationship of the outermost points to each other, like coordinates on a map. It's a rough guess in the beginning, but I placed these lines based on my initial impression of the shape. I tried to determine if the shape is square, or if it's rectangular, how much taller is the height than the width, and how parallel or non-parallel are the sides to each other. From the outside shape, I attached the cast shadow shape, which is essentially another envelope roughly based on the location of the cast shape. I moved to the inside of the cast by making a few marks to approximate where I think the lips are in relation to the outside edges. I consider the height relationships first, or how far down the lips occupy the space vertically within the outer envelope shape. I make a guess and then check that guess with a measurement tool. This process usually involves trying to find a unit of measure between 2 points that can be compared to other vertical distances within the cast. In this example, I notice that the distance from the bottom of the cast to the underside of the lower lip is roughly the same as the distance from the underside of the lower lip to the top of the upper lip. I make corresponding marks on my drawing using my measuring tool and then check their position a few times to verify that they're correctly placed. These marks serve as placeholders for where the lips should be roughly within the envelope of the cast. The tick marks themselves are intentionally left a little bit thick and vague to allow for some minor adjustment as the drawing develops. From these marks, I start to build the most visually obvious shape first. A shape is any space contained between two or more lines. Following this definition, a shape can be basically anything we see. For me, the easiest shape to concentrate on first is the shadow that bridges both the structures of the upper and lower lips. The shadows are useful shapes to identify first because they're oftentimes easier to see and draw accurately because they can be contextually removed from their environment and just evaluated for their abstract qualities. Sometimes I can imagine the shadow shapes as something completely foreign to what they actually are, like the silhouette of a bird or other creature. Abstracting the shapes helps us not focus on the anatomy or structure too soon in the drawing process, as we're sometimes more susceptible to bias or drawing from a preconceived idea about how we think something ought to look, rather than how it actually appears. To copy shapes accurately, I employ a process of looking at the individual straight lines or tilts and seeing how they relate to each other. Each straight line segment represents the distance and angle between 2 points in 2 dimensions. These lines, that give the block end its characteristic blocky appearance, are not meant to be a specific description of the contour, but instead are more like a summary statement that attempt to convey the trajectory a contour tends to take from one point of major change to the next. Soon after these shadow shapes are roughed in, I add a flat tone that helps me visually relate the linear block end to the real object I see in front of me in light and shade. The block end develops with this gradual refinement of the contours, breaking down the straight line tilts into smaller and smaller tilts that more accurately describe the ins and outs of the contour. The edges of the shadows are just as important as any of the structural or physical edges, as they convey a lot of information about the surface topography, as their shape must necessarily conform to the surface they're projected onto. I use varying line weight and line sharpness to convey the different types of visual phenomena I see. Shadow edges will always be softer than the physical edge where the cast overlaps the wall, so I express the shadow shape edges as either frayed or a little bit broken and discontinuous. While I don't try to add a lot of tone to these drawings initially, I can express the darker areas by adding emphasis to the edges of certain shadows where I see less light having an influence. For the soft edges of the upper lip and philtrum, I use more delicate lines than I do for the shadow edges. I use the halftone shapes that represent areas turning partially into shadow as a further gauge of shape proportion and accuracy. I'm not trying to shade or render the form in the drawing with the addition of these flat tone shapes, but instead I'm using these areas of flat tone to evaluate if there's enough room within the lines I've drawn to accommodate the information that they're meant to contain. It's really just a shorthand way for me to anticipate if my drawing scaffold will hold up to the form information I'm going to apply later with gradations of value. The block end slowly yields from a process of identifying shapes and fitting all these shapes together harmoniously into a much slower, more careful process of refining the straight lines into the more curved lines that I see on the cast. The idea is that once I have a sense for where everything is, I can then go back and more carefully examine the contours without having to worry about placement and proportion as much. Part of the process of refinement involves changing my thought process to consider my subject more three-dimensionally. This is where I ask myself if the shapes I've built in the block end add up to something that seems structurally cohesive and sound. For natural forms, usually this means asking myself if things are lining up from one side to the other, if the forms are essentially symmetrical. The drawing is complete when I've described the edges of the exterior and interior, overlapping contours, and shadows. I try to keep the drawing clean of excess information that might distract from the dominant light effect so that when I'm going to add value and express volume, I'll have a clear area to do so without any ambiguity as to where I'm starting and where I intend to end up. Cast drawing is an excellent way to demonstrate rudimentary drawing techniques, and it's something I use a lot both in my teaching practice and my own personal artistic development. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them below. Thanks.